This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz starts today's show by sharing information about anhydrous ammonia applications in the fall. Continuing the show is Kansas Farm Management Association economists Plummer and Tressie Mitzner to discuss end-of-year tax considerations. Robin Reid, K-State agricultural economist, also joins the conversation with details for a tax strategy educational series that is upcoming. Mike Brouk, K-State dairy specialist, rounds out today's show by encouraging producers to have a plan in place to care for their calves and young stock before the really cold weather. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show discussing an article from a recent agronomy update. And then to talk about his article, we're joined by K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, your agronomy article was titled Considerations for Fall Applications of Anhydrous Ammonia. And so why should producers be thinking about fall application?
Yes, this is a good time for thinking about anhydrous ammonia. Obviously, there are some advantages of putting fall application of anhydrous. Some of those are basically just give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of time, workload. In many cases, we may not even able to put anhydrous in the spring because of wet soil conditions. And so it is a good time of the year to do that. There are, of course, some considerations also in terms of price. You know, we can have oftentimes much better price during the fall, and even availability of anhydrous sometimes could be an issue in the spring. And so we do have many farmers who do fall application of anhydrous. But yes, like you mentioned, there are some considerations there that we just need to keep in mind.
And one of those considerations, fall usually means cooler weather, which can result in some cooler soil, which is important.
Yes, and this is a key factor. Soil temperature is really one thing that we need to look very closely for anhydrous. And so why is this important? If we think about just making sure that we don't lose that nitrogen by the time the corn is needed next year, we have to keep in mind that stay in place. And so if we kind of review a little bit what happened with anhydrous when you apply to the soil, obviously the ammonia, the NH3, pretty much immediately convert to NH4, which is ammonium. And that's basically a quick reaction that essentially just require water. And so, again, that extra hydrogen there and the ammonium basically becomes a stable form in the soil. So that's good. That's in a stable form. We typically, obviously, we're not going to use that ammonium. We're not going to lose that ammonium from the soil. It's a immobile form. So as long as we keep that ammonium in place, that's stable there in the soil. The challenge is once you have the ammonium NH4 convert to nitrate, NO3, the nitrate, as we know, is mobile, and we can lose that nitrate by leaching. We can also lose that nitrate by denitrification, basically gas losses of nitrogen. And so that's the key point here. We want to make sure and keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form as long as possible. Something to keep in mind is that ammonium conversion to nitrate is a microbial-driven process. And you mentioned soil temperature. And of course, as we have lower soil temperature, that microbial activity is going to slow down. And that's why it's important to be watching that soil temperature very closely as we are applying anhydrous this fall. Typically, the number that we like to keep in mind is 50 degrees or lower at 4-inch depth. And so if we look at the soil temperature in the region, look at that 7-day average is really what we like to see because, of course, we know there's going to be some fluctuations of soil temperature as well from day to day. But as we got that average temperature before 50 Fahrenheit at 4 inches, then we know the temperature is stayed low and it's going to likely continue to still stay low. And again, that microbial activity will significantly slow down and will keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form, which is stable and, again, very low risk of losing that for during the winter and spring months.
And could producers look into using a nitrification inhibitor?
Yes, and that's an excellent point. One of the things, again, the key point here is that we want to slow down that nitrification process as much as possible. So again, the main tool here is really temperature. Make sure soil temperature is low. But like you mentioned, nitrification inhibitor is another tool that we can use. Nitrification inhibitor is basically, like the name basically says, we're basically inhibiting that nitrification process. We basically kind of slow down that nitrification process even further, which basically, again, protecting that nitrogen and keeping most of the nitrogen in the ammonium form, which is, again, is the immobile form that is not going to be leaching or basically lost from the soil. And so that combination will be ideal, especially if we're thinking about earlier application of anhydrous. And if temperature is still a little on that borderline, I will strongly consider putting some nitrification inhibitor to get an extra help there and keeping that nitrogen in the ammonium form. And so again, that combination of temperature, low soil temperature, and a nitrification inhibitor with fall application can be very helpful. Now, overall, just to kind of discuss a little bit the practice of fall application of anhydrous in Kansas, in general, I will consider to be a good option. If we just think about Kansas environment in the fall and winter months, it's essentially dry conditions. And so chances of losing that nitrogen by leaching is low during the winter months. And so it is a good option from that standpoint. The main concern, of course, is really in the spring, right? And so that's really what we're trying to keep here. Make sure when spring comes, we still keeping most of that nitrogen in the ammonium form. And so that's really the main concern here.
You've mentioned leaching a few times. So do producers with extra sandy soil need to be careful?
Excellent point. And yes, this is where soil types becomes also a very important factor. Yes, if we are dealing with soil conditions that are more sandy soils, that will be a situation that I will, if all possible, avoid putting fall anhydrous application and try to target those fields for a spring application. Because, again, we are really dealing with a situation where leaching could be a big issue. And, again, any nitrification that happens and nitrate content in the soil may be more susceptible to losses in the spring. So if we think about soil types, typically most of our soils, are medium fine texture soils. Fall application of anhydrous is a good option, again, especially if we are looking at soil temperature and maybe using a nitrification inhibitor. But sandy soils are situations where we typically will not recommend any fall application, again, because of that higher risk of leaching and nitrogen losses.
And for producers who maybe are still extremely dry and have a lot of cracks in their ground, is there something they need to do when thinking about anhydrous ammonia application?
Yes, that's another good point. Of course, dry conditions could be a challenge. We mentioned earlier that we do need to have a little bit of water for that ammonia to convert to ammonium. The amount of water needed is not very large, so I don't really worry about that necessarily. However, when conditions are very dry, one of the challenges that we often see is that the injection point is not sealing well, essentially. So we are losing anhydrous basically at the moment of application. So that's another key factor that we need to think about. We often talk about ideal soil conditions when we apply anhydrous, and that really goes to the physical properties, right? Making sure that the anhydrous basically stays in place. If we need to do a deeper injection of anhydrous in those drier conditions, just to make sure the anhydrous stays, that may be something we need to consider. Again, drier conditions, and again, just to make sure the injection point is sealed well, we don't lose any ammonia in the process. That's another key factor as well this time of the year.
And Dorivar, as we talk about making sure the soil is cool enough, is there a temperature where the soil is too cold for anhydrous ammonia application?
That's a very good point. And again, really the key, I think, here goes back to if we have frozen ground, obviously the physical properties of that soil and being able to inject that soil, that anhydrous will be a challenge. And so that's not a problem as long as, again, we are able to apply the anhydrous effectively. And again, that's the key here. Of course, what ideal situation, what we want is to get low soil temperature, and then we have very low, much lower soil temperature moving forward to keep that nitrogen stable in the soil.
And for producers who'd like to figure out what their soil temperature is there a resource that can help them with that?
Yes, and this is a very good point. We do always point out the Mesonet, the Kansas Mesonet. There are many very useful information there. One of those is the soil temperature monitor that you can go and actually check for your specific location, the county, and just kind of looking at what's happening across the state and during the recent weeks as well. So that's an excellent source to monitor these.
And Dorivar, so is it accurate to say that anhydrous ammonia application in the fall can work for a lot of producers, but it may not be for everyone?
Yes, and like I mentioned earlier, I really do like fall application of anhydrous because it gives us many advantage. Flexibility in time, price could be an advantage in many cases. I know this year that's been something that I hear quite a bit is that we have some price advantage, and so that's definitely an option. I do like fall application of anhydrous for Kansas, but again, it's just we do need to pay attention to other details, which is very important. And again, that's one of them is soil temperature, application conditions, use of inhibitors. Those are going to be all very important to make sure that nitrogen stays there for the corn next year.
And Dorivar, maybe something that's not quite so much in your wheelhouse, but something really important to mention when it comes to anhydrous ammonia, safety.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about agronomics here, but that's really something that always important to remind people is that obviously it's a time of the year that we have to be careful, and safety with anhydrous is always something that we have to emphasize.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some considerations for fall application of anhydrous ammonia.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. I will link his Agronomy Update article as well as the Mesonet in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're getting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show discussing tax planning and strategies. And to talk about this, we're joined by KFMA economist Plummer and Tressie Mitzner, as well as K-State agricultural economist Reid. Robin, Chelsea, Tressie, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us on, Shelby.
And Tressie, beginning the conversation with discussing why is tax planning so important for producers?
Well, I think it's kind of well known that many businesses don't have a lot of flexibility with their income, but producers in agriculture do have that benefit. We have the advantage we can move income and expenses from year to year and attempt to even out our adjusted gross income rather than potentially having large income swings because of market volatility or change in yields or just a lot of the challenges that we face in the agriculture industry overall.
Chelsea, thinking about what type of approach is best to take when thinking about tax planning?
One thing we want to try to make sure our members understand is that it's not always the best idea to just try to pay the lowest amount of income tax each year. That sounds really appealing. Nobody likes to pay income tax. But really, we want to try and take an economic approach to the tax planning. And so that involves kind of looking at things over the long term from year to year. We want to try to maximize after-tax income. And so getting basically the most amount of money in their pockets after taxes, which doesn't always mean paying the lowest amount of taxes. And we try to recommend to producers that in order to build wealth, they will need to pay income taxes. That's just kind of how the structure is for our current tax law. And so just looking at the bigger picture too, we want to help them realize too, like get the best use of standard deduction and any other credits that they're going to get. And so usually that means having at least enough income to cover those, which could still lead to some income tax.
Chelsea, a lot of different factors there. And so what are a few of those tools you utilize with KFMA members?
So there are quite a few, and this is a pretty complex topic. So today we thought we would just kind of highlight maybe 4 primary ones. And this first one is going to be one that is probably going to be pretty prevalent in Kansas this year, and that is deferring crop insurance. So across the state, we've seen quite a few losses, and not just yield losses, revenue losses. So we are expecting to see a decent amount of crop insurance claims and proceeds for 23. There is the election to defer crop insurance proceeds. A farmer, a rancher, to be eligible for this, it needs to be their normal practice that they defer at least 50% of their crop income each year. As long as they normally do that, they're eligible to defer the taxation of those crop insurance proceeds. There's a couple other things. You can't defer revenue losses. So it needs to be losses due to yield and damage on your crop. If there's any proceeds that come due to price loss or like a revenue guarantee, those cannot be deferred. And then if they elect to defer, they have to defer the insurance proceeds on all crops. So if they're collecting some proceeds here towards the end of the year for corn or beans, and they elect to defer the yield portion of that, and they also collected some on wheat back in July, they would need to defer all of those crop insurance proceeds to the following year, not just on a crop by crop basis. Another really one that I think is going to be, there will be a lot of proceeds this year is on like pasture range and forage, also known as PRF. And those are not deferrable if there's anybody that is questioning that.
Tressie, are there other things that could also be done?
A tool that can be used for flexibility is also deferred payment contracts on grains. This allows producers to sell their grain and take advantage of the current market price if they're happy with that and worried that it might go down, but they can refer the receipt of that payment and the taxability of the income to the following year. So there's a few things that are really important, and there does need to be a written contract between the buyer and the seller, and it has to specify the quantity, the price, and the date of the payment. And in this case, it would need to be dated for 2024 in order for those to be legal contracts. If the producer's income ends up being a little lower, we can make the decision after the fact, and we can elect out of that installment treatment of the contract and tax the income in this year, even though that payment wasn't received until 2024. Just remember that this is on a contract by contract basis, so it's best to do smaller contracts of varying amounts so we can ideally pull back a portion that fits your needs correctly to set your adjusted gross income where you feel comfortable and what tax level you feel comfortable about. Something that we're running into a little bit in the North Central and Northwest area to the east of the Northwest Association is some co-ops are offering defer on demand contracts. And we just want to caution you that those are not legal contracts according to the IRS that are deferrable contracts. If you sign your crops up for a defer on demand contract, we would actually consider that as constructive receipt and need to tax that in this year. So please just be cautious of that when you're signing or when you're inquiring about that, and make sure that they're legitimate deferred contracts, and we can easily move those back and forth. When managed and utilizing these correctly, marketing grain through deferred contracts are just a really great option for producers.
Yeah, and I'll touch a little bit. One of the most popular tools is accelerating depreciation on asset purchases within the current year. But a couple of things just to caution on that. So there's two different methods to accelerate. You can use Section 179 or you can use bonus depreciation. One big reminder is if you purchase something from a related party, so son or daughter's buying something from dad or their parents, you cannot use accelerated depreciation on that asset. So just keep that in mind when you're purchasing that asset. Section 179 is more flexible. You can pick any dollar amount up to the purchase, but it does have a limit in 2023 of $1,160,000. So you cannot deduct more than that. There's an investment limit. It's a little over $2 million. So if you invest more, then it starts reducing the amount you can take for Section 179. Bonus does not have the investment or the deduction limit. So you can take more bonus. However, it's a little more rigid. It's 80% for 2023. That's down from 100% last year. And so if you have an asset that's not eligible for 179 and you decide to use bonus, the max you can depreciate of that asset is 80% during the current year. And then the rest will be set up for the life of the asset. Also, on the flip side, if for some reason your income is lower this year and you have a loss and you have some purchases, you can elect to slow down depreciation on assets as well to have lower expense during the current year. That is set up then for the remainder of that life for that asset, but that is another option if you're on the flip side and you need a little bit less expense.
The last one that we want to touch on today is prepays. Many producers will prepay expenses not only as a tax planning tool, but also because this time of year, running into the end of the year, a lot of companies will have price discounts or benefits for booking and prepaying. A few rules on deducting prepaid expenses: they cannot be more than 50% of the total expenses for the year, and they need to be for a specific quantity of a product and a specific price. It just can't be a down payment or a blanket payment to the co-op or the feed store or something. It really needs to be specific. And in a research audit, IRS could potentially look at those prepays and make sure that they're for price and quantities of specific items. So just be really cautious with that, but it's a wonderful tool that producers can use.
And Robin, as we are talking about taxes, and if producers would like to learn a little bit more about the different strategies, is there an opportunity looking ahead for them?
Yes, so we're actually going to have Chelsea and Tressie part of a multi-state program that we have coming up here in November and December. And this program is in conjunction with University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Purdue University in Indiana. So this program is going to be delivered with Zoom. If you miss one of the live sessions, we will also have the recordings that you can listen to at any time if you're registered for the program. But this series is really focusing on tax strategies and specifically for Midwestern farm and ranch women. Now, we say women as this is a USDA-funded program for underserved demographics, but just know this program and what we'll be covering in it would be applicable to all kinds of farms and all kinds of farmers. So the program dates for this are November 28th, December 5th, and December 12th, running from 6:30 to 8 o'clock Central Time for 3 weeks in a row. And the first night, we're really going to focus on just an introduction to taxation on farm and ranches. You know, basically what are income taxes? What is a Schedule F? What's cash versus accrual accounting? The second class, we're really going to get into those Schedule F basics. So Schedule F being what a farmer would report their farm and ranch taxes on. That's the IRS form that they use. So we're going to really cover that in detail, but also talk about how do you choose an accountant. On the third class, and this is the one that Chelsea and Tressie are actually going to be teaching, and it is on advanced topics in farm and ranch tax planning, 1099s, tax strategies like they just talked about, shifting income, accelerated depreciation, income averaging, and the loan forgiveness that was done through USDA this year. So really all three classes are going to build on each other, really give a good overview of farm and ranch taxation. And the reason we're doing it this time of the year is so some of these tools are known before the end of the year and some of that advanced tax planning can be done.
And Robin, what is registration for this event and where can people find out more information?
So registration is $30, and that includes the entire series, so all three meetings included in that $30. The easiest way to find it is go to our website, agmanager.info, and on our events page, you will see it listed. Again, the title is Tax Strategies for Midwestern Farm and Ranch Women.
That was K-State agricultural economist Robin Reid, and she was joined by Chelsea Plummer and Tressie Mitzner, who are KFMA economists. I will link the resources that Robin mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As colder weather arrives this fall and winter, dairy producers should be ready to care for their calves and young stock developing on their farms. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that involves knowing the cold weather procedures, making sure quality bedding is available, and providing calves and young stock with the additional calories they require.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning preparing for colder weather, and especially as we think about our dairy calves and our young stock that is developing on our dairy farms. You know, as we move into some cooler temperatures, a lot of times we forget that we need to work on some additional things every day in our chore package around the dairy. One of those issues would be with our calves and particularly newborns and making sure that they are in a dry environment and they get a dry hair coat first following calving. For many of you, you probably use calf blankets to keep them warm for a few days after birth. And again, if you do those sorts of practices on your dairy, you might need to make sure that those are clean and ready to go for the fall season and early winter. You might also want to review your procedures with those working with the calves to make sure everybody is in full agreement as to how we should treat our calves with cooler temperatures, and particularly as we start to look at some of these mornings that will drop into the lower 20s and even colder as we get a little deeper into the winter. So again, just some time to review with your staff that might be taking care of calves to make sure they understand when blankets need to go on calves and when they need to come off, making sure that those procedures as far as cleaning blankets between calves, make sure everything is in line and it's actually being done the way it should be. May have had some changes in your personnel since we had to deal with cold weather last here in Kansas, so making sure that everybody is on the same page is really important around the dairy. Second thing that we need to really think about is the quality of the bedding. Again, a lot of times this is overlooked until we start to have a problem with pneumonia in the calves or possibly scours. And again, just making sure that new personnel coming on to the farm since we had cool weather last spring, make sure everybody's on the same page as to when do we add bedding, how much do we add, is very important to keeping those calves dry. The third thing I'd like to suggest for these calves is changes in your feeding program. As we move into the cooler temperatures, we need to think about the amount of calories that we're providing to these calves and making sure that that's appropriate. Again, the issue generally arises when we're on twice-a-day feeding and we're only feeding 2 quarts of colostrum or 2 quarts of waste milk or some other milk replacer product as we feed our calves each day. So if you're on these more limited feeding programs, it is important that you recognize that calorie consumption is going to increase as these calves are experiencing colder weather, and making some adjustments to your feeding program by either fortifying the 2 quarts that you're feeding twice a day or implementing a third feeding sometime during the day of 1 quart to 2 quarts, depending on how cold it might be important in terms of making sure that all your calves have the right amount of calories. If you're already on an accelerated feeding program, probably isn't much of an issue because you're already feeding additional calories to those animals every day. This really comment only pertains to those that might be on 2 quarts twice a day in terms of liquid feeding for their calves. In addition, make sure that with your calves that you're keeping up on vaccination protocols, particularly as we approach weaning with these calves, to make sure that we provide the calves with some additional protection as they move from the liquid feeding program into the first stages of the heifer development program. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take a little bit of time to review their calf feeding procedures and communicate with those that are taking care of calves on their dairies.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.